Good afternoon, everyone. This is Matt Kinsman, Head of Content at SIA's Connectiv Division. Thanks again for joining us today for 5 steps to pre-call prep with MediaRadar. Cold calls aren't easy. We had a study that was featured in the Connectiv Daily earlier this week that said 1 out of 2 B2B sales reps actually fear making cold calls, while more than half give up too easily. Our speaker today, Todd Krizelman, CEO of MediaRadar, will share 5 simple recall steps to give the seller more power and win more deals. Before we get started, I'd just like to go over a few logistics. All attendee lines are currently muted, but you can submit questions at any time under the Questions tab in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Type in your question, then select Broadcast to co-presenters or Broadcast to all. You can also unmute your line at any time by hitting *7 to ask a question over audio. With that, Todd, please take it away.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for attending today and coming to this webinar. We spent a lot of time thinking about this topic, both for the webinar and just in general. We spent a lot of time studying sales reps and what makes the best sales reps really achieve their level, even when the market is very, very competitive. If I go and talk for just a second about MediaRadar, we have a little over 2,000 customers currently, and about half of them are B2B publishers. And we definitely study B2B separately from consumer and ad tech because there really are a number of things that are unique to it. But as part of that, for sure, we spent time trying to study why some B2B companies have so much success and others really feel like they're very much struggling in the 2018 market. And of course, in general, in the press, we read about the ones who are struggling more than the folks who are succeeding. And that was part of the genesis of this idea, was to go out into the market and talk a little bit about what works and why it works in terms of from a sales-specific standpoint. As for me, some of you on this phone may know me personally. I'm sure many don't. But know that a lot of my own personal background has been in selling, almost entirely for 20, I fear saying 25 years. I guess it's 24 years. Look, being great in sales is something that takes time. It's something that you ask lots and lots of questions about of others. I remember when I got started, when I was in high school at the Palo Alto Weekly in the Bay Area in San Francisco, south of San Francisco. And it's just then it was about being an apprentice. There was nothing written down ever about what made success. And so in MediaRadar, part of today is really going through what are the things that we see really work. And also we're going to start with a little bit of the paradox of our time. So one of the biggest paradoxes right now in the marketplace is basically you have a very healthy economy. And you know this if you're buying stocks, but market is very good. The amount of advertising being spent in the United States across consumer and B2B is $221 billion. And if you look at big companies like LinkedIn and Facebook, both which compete very aggressively now in the B2B market, obviously in the consumer market too, both these businesses are up, and Twitter are up significantly. Facebook, despite themselves, is up more than $10 billion year over year in total revenue. Most of that, by the way, comes from the U.S. market. It's not coming from some other place that is unrelated to us. But the paradox is that despite us showing that there's all this wonderful top-line growth and that the market's healthy, most B2B companies, for example, this last year on the average are down. And so part of our desire at MediaRadar is to acknowledge what's creating that challenge, and then what do you do about it from a tactical standpoint as a salesperson. So one, there's no question brands have more ways to advertise than ever. There are just, and a lot of times we think about, I worry that we think myopically, right? As we sort of say, oh, okay, these are my direct competitors who have the same audience or that sort of write or editorial have the same type of content. But these days, really, you're competing against, obviously, search with Google and Yahoo and others. You have LinkedIn and Facebook, which I find that many people discount, especially LinkedIn in the B2B market. Some people will say, well, LinkedIn is its own thing. It's a directory service for resumes, and it is, but they know a lot about those people. And so these are the things that make the market so competitive right now, right? And it's like this is the paradox, right? Despite the greatness that there's so much money out there, and you know this, basically there's lower barriers to entry to compete. There's lower barriers to entry to compete. There's more competition than ever. And so that I was thinking about this. This was like from a graph that anyone who took like first year economics, first day, first week, it was like, if there's too much supply, price comes down. All right. And then on top of this, of course, besides those macroeconomic issues, you have just the tactical issue of the reality that the person you're trying to reach is overwhelmed with email. At MediaRadar, we have 21 people in sales at MediaRadar. And I'm always talking to my own team at MediaRadar. I'm the founder and the CEO of what it's like to be in management at any company. And many of you on the phone know this. You are just suffocating in communication. Right? There's the average person receives 121 emails per day. That is for sure consistent with my own personal experience. I was talking to our head of marketing, Jackie Hoffman, just as we were preparing for this, and I said, this is what we're all really up against. Even in a phenomenal economy where things are perfectly fine, you're up against just trying to get through the clutter. So let's talk about what to do. So five big picture sort of things you must do before you identified your opportunity, you know who you want to go after. It's like, what are the 5 things you got to do? And I think a lot of you on the phone, if you've been selling for years, you're going to say, I know some of these things. I tried to find an even balance between sort of things you know you should do and just how to do them better. And then for others who really don't know, just to really show like all of the nuts and bolts of what makes a sale great. Your opportunity, you have to know it thoroughly. You have to know if you're trying to sell some type of sponsorship, an event, any type of advertising marketing package, you must know their strategy. And look, part of being a good partner is asking those questions, but there's a lot you can learn even before you get in the door. Also, why should they work with you? You do need to know your competition. It doesn't mean bring them up, but it definitely means when inevitably when someone says, hey, why should we buy with your B2B journal or magazine or media company, that you can really articulate the key reasons how you're differentiated and being able to communicate your offering. So what does it mean to know an opportunity thoroughly? What does that even mean? It's interesting. Look, part of this, and I'm going to use John Deere as an example that I'm going to weave through my narrative through this next 30, 40 minutes throughout. Basically, I want you I wanted to anchor this in a real discussion. Part one is, especially if it's a public company, you actually want to go to the SEC, either their own site or you could go to the SEC public website, which is sec.gov, and pull down their public filings. What are the divisions of the company? And John Deere is a good example of it because they have pieces of their business that are completely B2B oriented. They have also some that are, of course, very consumer minded. We want to understand what is the revenue by division. And a lot of times in public information, they will reveal where the challenges are and where the opportunities are and where they're going to be making capital investments and innovation. Those things, if it's a publicly held company, think about Monsanto or John Deere in this market, or brands that are creating combines like IHK, the ag market in my mind now. This is important to know. Right? You just have to look it up. And if it's a smaller company, it's even easier. You can go to you can just go to their public website and read. We want to understand revenue levels. Of course, we want to understand agencies, and many companies like John Deere use multiple agencies to accomplish. Sometimes we find different agencies are attached to different media formats. Sometimes it's a territory thing. And for sure, we see if a brand has B2B and consumer, they will often use different agencies to represent their interests in both. And of course, once you've identified the agencies and the people, many B2B brands, of course, do not use agencies. The largest often do. We need to understand who to talk to. And look, part one is understanding who they are and what is their role and responsibility inside the company. It's also understanding where they are. Sometimes it's like understanding if one group of people is in the LA office versus another out of Des Moines. These are different cities with different character profiles. And also there are basic things, just simply like, hey, different time zones, different weather conditions. These are things that as a sales rep, you're going to be thoughtful about when you make a call and what you might talk about even on a voicemail. By the way, bring up the stuff around weather as an example and the time of day. These are things that clients actually asked us to build into MediaRadar that we had not thought about. It was like, look, if there's hurricanes in Iowa, not hurricanes, excuse me, if there are tornadoes in Iowa, like I want to make sure I'm being thoughtful of that when I'm picking up the phone. Now look, for those who are experienced sales reps on this phone call, all of us know when you meet with a client, the most important thing to do is ask them questions about what their objectives are, and that allows you as a salesperson to then think about how do you offer the best possible solution to help a customer. But across B2B publishers, we do hear one piece of feedback, which is it's harder and harder to get meetings. There's just scarcity of time. And so the more you can glean and know an objective by studying the customer's SEC filings and studying what they talk about in their press releases, the better you're going to come off in just getting the meeting and presenting the best information, putting your best foot forward right in that first moment. When I first got started in my career, I can remember I was expected to have like a dozen in-person meetings per week. Those days are gone everywhere. It doesn't matter if you're the best Facebook rep or the best LinkedIn rep. It doesn't matter how well. It's just the market is not like that. And so a lot of us think knowing what the business objectives are ahead of time is key. We find that you can glean that information. You can discover that through press clippings, SEC filings, investor relations sections. In the case of John Deere, this is real. Basically, they've talked about having data-enabled equipment. By the way, this is the only part of the meeting where I started to realize that John Deere and B2B SaaS businesses are starting to converge on each other. That's an unusual. They're selling the information that's taken from the equipment. They're trying to grow globally. Many of the people on this call publish not just in the U.S., but outside of the U.S. Of course, they want to improve their financial performance. And they specifically talk about getting ahead of competition. This is an area that they actually have some challenges with. Now, this I thought was very unusual, and I loved this. This is right off their public site. They actually talked about how the industry is doing and how John Deere is doing versus the industry. And these two markers here I thought were really interesting, right? They basically talked about two types of tractors where the market is up 11 and 36%, but John Deere is not keeping pace. They're up, but they're not keeping pace. So if I were going to go try to pitch John Deere, even before I've asked all those good questions, this is clearly an important part of the dialogue. It's bringing these things up preemptively to demonstrate that I'm a thoughtful salesperson, a thoughtful person who's done their homework ahead of time. If you went into MediaRadar and you just typed in John Deere, you actually see they're buying a lot of different types of media. And I think this is part of when you think about your prep, you actually, it's going to be important you look at your competitive set. You're going to want to look at where does John Deere buy audience that is similar to me. But the reason I showed this slide was also to demonstrate how broad the buy is. a lot of times, and this happens on consumer and in B2B media, there's often blinders on. It's like, well, we've always competed against these 3 to 5 companies. That's it for me. All the other spend they do doesn't matter. We would argue when we look at the people who make the sales reps who are making the most money, they are interested in seeing what is the full marketing budget. Because that gives you a little bit better sense of, okay, maybe they haven't been spending that much with my competitors or with me, but they have a huge budget maybe for the same product that they're marketing with me. And so seeing the full view we think is important. Clearly you want to understand before you go into a meeting what audience are they targeting. And I think, and John Deere I like because there's complexity here. Right? They have consumer, they have B2B. Within B2B, they go after different markets, right? They go after, as an example, people who own or run the landscaping at golf courses, universities. There is basically a very wide set of folks besides agriculture, as an example, that they're going after. And we see that there's also some geographic concentration, right? There are more golf courses and more ag efforts in certain parts of the country than others. We also see this on the consumer side. And again, I like this as if I'm a salesperson, I want to be a good partner and knowledgeable, even though if I'm a B2B publisher, I'm not confused that the consumer TV stuff is like also for me. But nevertheless, I want to understand what is the total size of the buy. I want to understand in terms of the marketing budget. I also want to understand what's important to the company, right? So, for example, are they marketing small tractors? Are they marketing affordable pricing and leasing? I thought this was fascinating that you could get AC, air conditioning on your large tractor now. That was marketed, by the way, as a luxury, which I thought was interesting. All this stuff, we just want to be a good partner, so we want to know it all. And then on top of that, of course, we want to understand what are the format differences. So often we're just told to believe that, digital is always up and print must always be down. By the way, just an asterisk using MediaRadar metrics, we find that's mostly true, but it's not always true. In like 20% of cases, brands are doing, like they're loading up on print because it works. And in fact, like after 20 years of digital, which is basically what it's now been since the web was invented, it's not like digital has just snuck up on us. And most sophisticated media buyers and brands know this, right? If print's working for them, they invest more. In this case, the year over year, there was a 25% increase. We also want to understand geographically where is their concentration, demographically. And when I'm talking about demographic, I don't mean like household income or anything like this, or men versus women. In this case, we're really talking about job functions. Sometimes it's level of education, role and responsibility, the things that we would expect to be relevant for B2B publishers. So as an example, John Deere has major concentration in places like Iowa, where there's a lot of farming. Without question, to understand a client and what their objectives are in real time, for sure you want to see the creative. I think in B2B, it's interesting. 3 or 4 years ago, that we saw a huge difference between the type of advertising and media that like a consumer brand would run versus a B2B brand. But there are now many examples where there's no difference at all. Basically, we see brands like John Deere, and John Deere is a great example of this. They're sophisticated. They're buying, on the B2B side, they're buying mobile, doing email marketing. Of course, they do a sponsorship and events, native advertising, which is sort of sponsored content, sponsored edit, video. It's everything. There is sophistication there. And I bring that up because I think it's part of understanding when you're going into a pitch and you want to win, you really want to win. It's like doing the research to see what was the messaging, what is the tone, who do they feature in the ads, the kind of person, all of that is important. We also want to see not just like how much money does John Deere spend in B2B publishing. No, we need to know what are the specific products that are being marketed. What is the budget for those? Are they being purchased in print, television, mobile, email, like events? Like what is it? And so being able to know that again when you walk in the door makes you a better partner. And of course, which products. So we talked about product launches, which was the last page, and then the full list. I thought this was really interesting in John Deere, by the way. Just one takeaway as I was sort of studying for this. This is true for a lot of big brands like John Deere, where they have established base, a huge amount of, I think of them as like upsells, accessories, nozzles. It's additions to existing tractors and products. Clearly, another thing to do is to read the news. Now, look, I think a lot of us, first of all, every one of you on the phone read the news around your endemic industry. That's just to be certain. But that can be daunting. Like for me, I have about a 40-minute commute in each morning. I spend all 40 minutes reading industry news. Right? So for the media market, I read Media Post and Ad Exchanger and Digiday and Folio and this long, and certainly Bo Sachs and this long list. All of us do that. The more I can get it in a feed, the better. The more I can have it emailed to me so it's all in one, the better. Because I do think it's daunting. Even for those, you say you've been doing this for 20 years, you know everything. There's news that breaks, you want to know about it, but you don't want to have to open up 20 different emails. Okay, one last note on this first point, which comes up as a difference between A and B players. When you go and give a pitch, know the name of the person you're pitching. Know the name of the I don't mean know the name. Sorry, I mean know how to pronounce it. Go online. Listen to it. It is very embarrassing if you can't figure that out. That is a quick way to alienate the person you're with. Also, if I were going to go to a meeting in Omaha, I would read the local Omaha newspaper the night before. If I were pitching someone there, I'd want to know what was happening locally. Even if, by the way, this is just a John Deere meeting and it's going to be just about tractors and mowing lawns. It's important to know. I've learned over the years to be as personable as possible and care, right? Show that I'm really all in. You think about every one of you on the phone. Think about how much time goes in to getting to the meeting, getting to an in-person or sort of a WebEx meeting. It is typically a month or months of time to establish that. And so a lot of time should go into being completely knowledgeable about a client. All right, tip 2, know the ad strategy. In publishing, this is another paradox I want to reveal. In publishing, we have spent years now saying how we have to do cross-format selling. We shouldn't have a digital person and a print person. We should have one person who can sell everything that has the relationship. In B2B media, there are still many players who don't buy integrated. And John Deere is a great example of this. This chart is basically saying that almost no one who they work with, no media company, very few media companies they work with basically get part of the buy in multiple formats. You either win digital or you win print. Right. And basically, my point in this is just to know that before you go in. Now, we asked a question here. One question is a little bit like, okay, is the problem here simply that maybe publishers don't pitch them integrated buys? Maybe, right? We don't know. What we do observe is for sure the way the money gets split up is that most of it is very segmented by media format. But that would be something I'd want to know before I walked in. I'd want to address it. I would want to say, how do I become one of the 7.6 who are getting cross-format buys? I also want to understand renewal rates. Renewal rates tell us what's working and what's not working for the customer, right? It's a litmus test. It's sort of how are we doing right now. Golfdom, Equipment Today, Successful Farming, they're winning 70% renewal rates. This is obviously, this is the overall renewal rate for John Deere, not for their 3 titles. But all those 3 titles were basically we're winning more business. In television, which for sure is more consumer-oriented, also very high retention. Average retention, by the way, in the market is across the whole market in B2B is closer to 45%. And so knowing that, first of all, John Deere, this suggests that if you're a good partner to them and they like you, you're going to win the business, re-win the business. One thing that I thought was super interesting was the renewal rates on digital is really low. So know that we track those in MediaRadar. We think that's basically, it's important to know before you go into a meeting. So you could say, look, I see that with your print partners, with your television partners, you guys continue to re-up, but in digital maybe you haven't nailed it yet, or I want to understand what hasn't worked. If I'm going to be a great partner to John Deere, I need to know in the meeting why it didn't work, not just go off and say why I think we will. This is obviously a key thing, and it's something that all of you train your staff on knowing, like, what are the key reasons that your media company, your audience, is the best solution, the best fit for a brand. It starts, though, with thinking about, what is the opportunity here, basically. In John Deere's case, we've talked about how they're performing below the industry average for certain segments of the tractor market. They're struggling to find strong digital partners. They seem to renew only 1 out of 5. But on the other hand, we see that they're spending across different media formats, and specifically with digital and TV, they're really marketing their small tractors. So when you think about that marriage, understanding who is the audience that someone is reaching, I like to have them side by side. That was the way I guess I was originally taught. I like being able to understand. It's like, okay, if they have 3 or 4 different campaigns and each has a different audience target and objective, I want to match each of those against me. So on the left is just completely made up, but basically the idea was on the left is you as a publisher, and on the right is them. But I like to connect the dots as much as possible. I've been at MediaRadar for a little over 10 years, and at MediaRadar obviously I'm selling MediaRadar. Before that, I always sold magazines and digital, and I did that for more than a dozen years. And so it's just having the transparency is really helpful. So visualizing the solution to the customer's problem, how are we a good fit for audience? How are we going to position our recommended campaign to meet their objectives, the frequency and the pricing? All of that I want to be as transparent as possible. I think a lot of people do this well, by the way. I think of the things we're talking about, I think talking about yourself is always the easiest of the things. It's talking about the client and being a good listener that's the place where we get tripped up. It's interesting. I was at the Folio show last week, and one of the things, this is something I talk a lot about with my own team at MediaRadar, and it came up when we were talking about native advertising in B2B last week. It's understanding from the beginning what are the campaign goals. A lot of us get that right. Understanding the metrics that we're going to be evaluated is something that is often left out. I think in the early days of digital, as an example, was like, well, you've purchased a certain number of impressions, and you're in charge of the creative. We're the people running that creative in front of our audience. That's very similar to print, right? You're buying a page that's going into our magazine, and our audience shall read that. You're in charge of that creative. If the creative is great and your product's great, you sell more stuff, and if not, it doesn't work out. Increasingly, the most successful sales reps, like when I go back, like at MediaRadar, we can go back and see which reps are having the most success. We find that when we interview them, defining the metrics and really pushing in advance, like you've signed, the IO's out, you've done it, you're just doing the deal. It's like, how are we going to be evaluated? How are we? I say this myself. I don't want to go back to a MediaRadar customer in a year and ask for a renewal and not know if it was good, if it was helping or not. I was the same way as an ad sales rep. I want to know how I'm going to be evaluated. And by the way, this is for everyone's benefit, right? You want to know this at the beginning. We want to write it down. Some people, some of the most successful reps will sign it. Like they'll ask the customer to say, all right, success means we sell this many more units because of this campaign. And that could be more specific seeds or pesticides if that's Monsanto, but like it's being or unit tractors of a particular model, but defining what success means at the beginning. And certainly we see, and this is not at a rep level, but some B2B publishers offer guarantees. They say, listen, if you're going to market a certain volume of dollars at a certain frequency, we will stand behind this because we know our audience well enough, and we will offer a guarantee. So key pre-call tip number 4, you got to know the competition. I grew up in Silicon Valley, and so I can remember my father talk about Andy Grove, who is one of the 3 co-founders of Intel. And he had this phrase, which is well known, which is only the paranoid survive. And that is certainly the model that I personally subscribe to. I want to know everything about my own competition, and you do too. You want to know how the audience differs from yours, how the quality of the editorial is different. You want to understand the frequency, if it's print, if it's digital, it doesn't matter. We want to know. And so that means not bringing the competition up preemptively. That can be distasteful. Bashing a competitor is almost never helpful. Someone might be spending money with your competitor. They've made a decision because presumably they thought it was a good idea. So I think you want to be thoughtful and know the competition and be able to mitigate and differentiate yourself from them. But it's definitely not a recommendation to bash or talk down or to even bring them up. It's really when they're brought up to be thoughtful and really knowledgeable about how you're different from them. By the way, I will go back to this one thing. Lots of junior salespeople have never been told that sentence. I just think you go in and they just bad talking a competitor, and that never goes well, or almost never goes well. And additionally, we want to know about, of course, the client's competition, right? So not in the first case, we're talking about your competition. This is, if I'm going into John Deere, I want to know who are all the people they compete with, and how am I going to be a good partner to say, you know what, by understanding your business objectives, that we can talk knowledgeably about this marketplace really well. Most B2B people will know because you know your endemic marketplace, you're going to know the names for sure. The question is, can you really be very thoughtful, right? That you know more than just the surface level of the competition. All right. So pre-call tip number 5, know how to effectively communicate your offerings. There are some, and Matt was talking about this at the very beginning, know that first, the motivation, 75% of executives who've been prompted to attend an event or take an appointment as a result of a cold call or email, it works. Know that outreach by telephone in particular is very effective. Something that we will hear a lot from younger sales reps is, oh, it's a different generation. If you're under 30, an email is fine. And I've learned both personally at MediaRadar as well as through hundreds of our clients This is complete rubbish. Yes, of course, we all check our email and use texts way too much. We're drowning in that. How many of you still have a mail room, right? You know what's very effective? Sending something to a person and it's handwritten. Picking up a phone, very effective way. And it doesn't mean that you're going to have a call. In fact, you're probably not. It may just simply be having the human connection, hearing the voice. You're going to have an opportunity to have the tone and inflection and conviction in terms of presenting your value. And definitely it's faster to get a meeting. There's plenty of data out there, and it is completely true. If you call early, if you had your sales reps just call in the morning, like they came in between 7:30 and 9, and you had them leave for most of the day and then had them come back between 5 and 7, did all the calls then, you'd be very successful. That's when people pick up their phone. They're vulnerable. This is very tactical. I put, because I know we're going to distribute these slides to you afterward, know that we put in some sample language in here for you. But for voicemail, you want to have a very brief voicemail that is simply not robotic. All of you in B2B have something that's very, very unique and different from all the big consumer companies, which is this is about a very narrow market that's completely endemic, right? You're not you're not robo-calling millions of people if you're in the agricultural market or almost any B2B market. And so one of the most important tips for voicemail, because that's what mostly you're going to be leaving, is just to be clear that it's like a nice person, a nice human, like that you're human and not a robocall, and that you're a nice person and that you're going to call back. Another thing is just remember, you're going to need to be both patient and persistent. Many sales reps do not, as Matt was mentioning at the beginning, do not like to make calls. Half of people dislike it. It is part of the job, and it takes 8 to 10 calls to get a prospect to have any connection with you typically. Some reports we read on this, by the way, put a number at more in the 20 to 30 contact points, touch points. So that could be marketing plus telephone calls. Like it takes a lot, even for a company that knows you. You say in a B2B endemic market, everyone must know you. They may still know you, and they may still want to do business with you, and it may still take you 20 tries to get across. That's normal. That's the new normal for someone. If you think about your customer who's getting 121 emails per day. All right. When you're talking to an actual person, look, have your talking points ready, capture attention right away, get to the point. And if it's an unscheduled meeting, there's something that we've seen a number of very successful reps do where it's important to acknowledge you've interrupted someone, right? You're calling someone at 8 in the morning or 7:30 in the morning before work. Maybe you've almost certainly interrupted them to say, hey, I'm sorry, I've just interrupted you. I wanted to follow up on my emails, but be humble. This is the most sobering statistic, and we see this statistic a lot. It's not enough. A lot of us grew up, like when I started to learn about sales management, you've been taught to count, how many phone calls were made. But that's actually not the only metric you should be measuring. You actually need to measure frequency of calls to the same opportunity, right? So this statistic is not like across, it's basically very persistent. We see it both in B2B customers, and when we go out and talk to customers about it, it's something that comes up all the time, is either people are giving up too soon. Like we talked about that, you really need to be at a minimum of 10 touch points to even get through to your first meeting. Knowing that almost half of people giving up after the first call, people just don't realize how hard it is to break through. And again, we put in some detailed examples here just because I knew the deck, some of you are going to want the deck afterward, and you can either, actually the easiest, you could just email me just at toddk@mediaradar.com, and that way you can get the actual deck. But the idea is that we're making this available to you. Same thing with email. Communication should be clear, succinct, brief. The better you follow that, you know this, the better the outcome. Personalize when possible. This is always a debate internally between marketing and sales professionals, is you want to reach the highest number of folks, but we also know in sales, and this bears out in the numbers, personalization greatly impacts outcome. And so if it can, and that doesn't mean just like, Dear Steve, it means having some additional knowledge about the market or about the customer that shows and demonstrates this is personal. All right. So just to wrap up, the key learnings here are, one, and in some ways, I feel like knowing the opportunity thoroughly is still just absolutely essential to being a true partner. Doing the homework. This is where we see people drop the step. You're in a hurry. You haven't done your homework. This is the place that we see the most sloppiness. Know your prospect's advertising strategy before you even get in there, so you know what they're doing and the level of investment. Know why they should work for you. That's the thing we actually see is often the strongest. Know the competition, but do not bash them and be mean-spirited about it. Know how to communicate your offerings, and that's a tactical thing. It's like, how do you write good email? How do you leave a proper 10 to 20-second voicemail? These are the things that we see when we study the best reps, the people who make the most money. These are the things that we most observe. And with that, we are going to go to this next page here. We're going to go into a period of Q&A. I also wanted to thank, there was a woman who helped in the development of this analysis and slides, a woman named Allison Heisler, who we've used over many years. If any of you needed sales training, this is not a paid endorsement or anything like this, just a person we've worked with and had real success with over the years. And so I wanted to make sure I acknowledged her contribution. With that, many of you have submitted questions and comments over the 35 minutes, and we're going to go take some of those now.
That's correct, folks. We have two options for asking questions. One, you can type your question into the Q&A box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Type in your question, and then you can select broadcast to co-presenters or broadcast to all, and we'll be able to see your question come up. Alternately, you can also unmute your audio line, hit *7. You will be live, and you'll be able to ask your question. Todd, we do have one question that came in here. It's a little broad, but it addresses your comments on really understanding the advertising strategy of the prospective client. And the question is, how can we ask questions that will help get our prospective targets, prospects, to share their advertising strategy?
So I often will say, and I think of this both in my current job here at MediaRadar, but definitely through the dozen years selling advertising, I would frame it as, so instead of just saying like, here's what I want to know, I would say, you know what, I want this meeting to be as valuable as possible. You've agreed to this meeting now. I want to make sure I use this time to make sure I present what really matters to you. Talk to me a little bit about what's most important to you now, what has worked, what has not worked. And then a small detail is stop talking immediately after the question. Let the void pull someone in subconsciously a little, if that makes sense. So the questions themselves, yeah, I've learned that it's important to explain why I want to know the information, that it's not, because some people naturally, most people are naturally a bit secretive essentially, but I'll explain why it's essential. I want to be a better partner. But the sincerity of it really will matter.
All right, very good. Todd, another question that's come in. You talked a lot about how we need to make cold calls. We need to make that human contact and not just rely on email. But when we are talking about email, what are the best ways to really get through the email clutter?
So there are a few things that we've certainly identified. The subject line is incredibly important. with 120 emails to the average executive per day. A very basic thing is if you're that executive, how do you get through your inbox through the day? And so what we find is that naming the company helps. And actually, Jackie Hoffman, who's our marketing director, just handed me something. She said, 33% of people open their emails based only on the subject line alone. So yeah, so some of the things we've learned, name their competition in the title. So name them so like that the email, when you're doing a mail merge, don't just say like the name of your company or how I can help you or new innovations. Say like John Deere, versus IH Case or John Deere solutions to really improve sales for 2019. But be specific that it's clear it's about them. The more personalized, even in the subject line. I'll give you an example. We ran a campaign even at MediaRadar, and we almost, if you're a MediaRadar customer on the phone, you'll see many emails that have the name of an advertiser or the name of you. And that's because we see something like 70% open rates on some of those emails. So being targeted help. Another thing I would share, and this is probably a thing just for 2018-19, I don't know, but you can put emojis in the email. And so there are people studying that the use of emojis, these are the things you see on your phone, you can put those in the subject line. And again, I think this is like anything else. If you did it all the time, it would become overbearing and not helpful. But if you use it sparingly, it can be effective.
All right, very good. Folks, we've got a couple minutes left in the webinar. If you do have questions, please submit them in the Q&A tab in the lower left-hand corner of your screen or hit *7 to unmute your line. Todd, we've got another question that's come in around Robo Calls. I know you're talking about direct cold calls, but do you find Robo Calls at all effective?
No. For B2B, we have found them not to be effective. Robo calling clearly is in some ways cost effective. It is also effective at getting out, like you think about if you're a debt collector. This is how I guess the worst way we think about robocalls. Robocalls can make 20 million calls in a day, and that's where it's very effective, is it can get out the word, whatever the word needs to be. Right? You see this for polling for elections in the days before key election points. But in B2B, and not all B2B, but most B2B is working within an endemic market, where there are a few thousand sales prospects. The more it can be, and none of them don't matter, right? Basically, all of them matter because it's a niche. It's a B2B endemic market. The more you can humanize it, the better. And I would say let's say you're a small B2B publisher on the phone and you have two full-time sales reps, you might consider there are third-party companies that will essentially you pay for scheduling meetings. So if they schedule a meeting in your market, then you pay them. That has been effective for some B2B clients we know. And if you follow up by email with me, we could give you some of those names. But that's another way of doing it. If you say, look, I only have money for 2 reps, basically, but I'm willing to pay $500 for every a meeting that actually happens, that's an effective way to multiply your efforts.
Very good. Todd, I actually have a question for you, and it's specifically around your points about John Deere and how they're not really set up to receive proposals for integrated buys, that their people are really focused on dedicated disciplines. I'm just curious because you see so many different publishing companies trying to set themselves up to sell that big integrated buy. We have a session coming up at the Business Information and Media Summit where Informa is going to be talking specifically about how they're empowering their sales reps to sell marketing services and the integrated buy. What advice would you have to advance that conversation, to go from the purely transactional, hey, you're going to buy digital, you're going to buy print, to this more integrated sale?
So I would address it, first of all, I would address it up front. In the case of John Deere, specifically, there are hundreds of media companies that basically get one media format. But Matt, there are 42 that did win at least 2 or more media formats. And so our sense of looking at this is acknowledge at the beginning of the process that your solution is 360. It's not a format buy. And actually, just simply saying those things also helps people change their, John Deere, change your perception of you, that you're coming to them as a partner who has audience, and you live with that audience wherever they may be. Farm Journal does an exceptional job of this from media and data. And so being consultative rather than selling something transactional and using that language right from the beginning of the sales process is very important to breaking through.
All right, very good. We do have one more question. Since it is so challenging to get meetings these days, what are your tips for getting that face-to-face meeting?
I think so one is, there's a very common thing we hear from clients where whoever you're calling says now is the busy time. I'll be less busy after an event. I'll be less busy after the holiday. I'll be best busy after, my child gets through their birthday. Whatever the excuse, the explanation, that's more diplomatic. It helps to acknowledge those barriers preemptively, to say, like when we talk to sales reps who are having more success, they'll say, you know what, for this to be effective, I really want to come see you. I want to have a meeting with you. And I know that life is incredibly busy. I am calling you because I have a genuine solution that can help you accelerate your business. And just to acknowledge that life is busy, but like, instead of waiting for the excuse to come and then to try to defend why you should come visit someone, get an in-person meeting while you deserve it, instead preemptively explain. And leverage all that pre-call research. Say, look, sometimes people will tell us, you have to be very explicit, like, hey, I'm not just robo calling you. You're not customer number 10,001 for me. This is an endemic, list of, I'm only calling people who are exactly like you, and I have studied your market, and I can be a real partner. But saying all those things, normally, even if you do it, you sort of don't reveal all that until later when you're like in the meeting. Preemptively saying all that for sure is very helpful. I'll share one other tactical tip, especially if you're certain you can help someone. Just go see them. Just say, I'm going to be in town tomorrow, and I'm asking for a few minutes of your time, and I could get some Dunkin' Donuts and some coffee and meet with you if you wouldn't mind indulging with me. That piece only works if you're really certain that you know their business. But I find that when we interview people, that comes up, which is, we're positive we're a good fit for John Deere, and this guy's been crazy. He's always traveling. The contact is so busy, and I'm just going because I have conviction that what I'm saying is right. And normally that works about 4 out of 5 times. So it does not work every time, but it will work a lot. And also the customer will, the person at John Deere who sees you sitting on their actual steps of the company, also there's a recognition like, oh, I guess you're really serious. If you came out to my office with some donuts and coffee this morning, like they may make you sit for 2 or 3 hours while they try to figure you out into their schedule, but it's a little bit like popping into the doctor's office when you're really sick. They take the appointment.
Okay, very good. Todd, we're just about out of time. Any parting words for the audience?
I wanted to thank everyone. I know how busy everyone is. I hope that you do provide feedback. Often after these sessions, we'll send out a survey for how this was. I'm very interested in how we can be better partners, and doing these webinars, and some of you know we also do in-person live events to do industry thought leadership. know that that's really important to MediaRadar, really important to me. And so if you liked this format, I would love to hear from you. If you liked most of it but hated one part of it, I'd want to know. And if you thought it was a total waste of your time, you're probably already gone. But if you're still there, let us know. It's valuable feedback.
Todd, thank you very much. And we're happy to have Todd and MediaRadar today. We're also happy to have Todd and MediaRadar speaking at the Business Information and Media Summit next month, which is November 12th to November 14th in Fort Lauderdale. We have a dedicated advertising and marketing services track with sessions ranging from, as I mentioned before, empowering sales reps to sell marketing services, to the best ad formats in the age of Google ad blockers, courtesy of MediaRadar, to mapping the customer journey, and then also compensation plans that make sense for ad sales. You can see more about the conference at siia.net/bins. Thank you for joining us today. An archive will be made available to all registrants. Thank you again to Todd and MediaRadar. This concludes the webinar.